Laura is humiliated into signing a divorce by her CEO husband, Grant, who flaunts his mistress and offers a insulting $50,000 payout. He believes he's self-made until the anonymous capital propping up his company is yanked overnight. A trusted family ally steps in, revealing Laura's hidden identity and the paper trail. Morality clauses, frozen accounts, and ownership filings that prove Grant only held borrowed power. Laura returns to the boardroom to expose fraud, reclaim control, and rebuild her life with dignity. Rain hammered the penthouse windows. Laura stood barefoot on cold marble, still in the faded cardigan she wore to the clinic, her wedding ring biting into a swollen finger. On the coffee table, divorce papers lay like a sentence. Grant Mercer didn't look at her. He checked his watch, one she'd bought by skipping lunches, and kept an arm around Sienna Park, his new VP of brand. Sienna's perfume filled the room, sweet and suffocating. "Sign it, Laura," Grant said. "Investors at 8, don't drag this out." Laura's throat burned. 3 years? That's all we were? A box to tick? "It's life," Grant replied. "We were both nothing. I became something. I built Blue Arc. You stayed... you." His eyes flicked to her plain jeans, the coupon envelope in her pocket. "You don't fit my world anymore." Sienna laughed. "Take the settlement and be grateful. $50,000 is more than you've ever held." Laura read Clause 4, saw the neat number printed beside her name, and felt something inside her snap. She remembered nights proofreading Grant's pitch decks until her eyes blurred, mornings making coffee while he practiced speeches, the way she'd begged her father to stay invisible so Grant could love her without a price tag. She lifted her gaze. "If I sign, there's no undoing it," she said, voice steady. "Not for me, not for you." Grant rolled his eyes. "Stop performing. You're replaceable. The company isn't." A tiny red light blinked from the smoke detector above the bar, Grant's security upgrade last month. Laura had noticed it. She'd said nothing. She picked up the gold pen and signed. Then she folded the settlement check once and tore it straight down the middle. "Keep your pennies," Laura whispered as the pieces drifted to the floor. "You're going to need every last cent." She walked into the storm without a coat. The elevator swallowed her, until the lobby doors slid open and a black armored sedan rolled to the curb, waiting like an answer. The driver opened the rear door and said, "Welcome home, Ms. Hale." Laura Hale was 45, and she had learned to measure life in small payments, a copay here, a pill refill there, the electric bill pushed one more week. At 5:30 a.m., she let the Maybach drop her a block from Lakeside Family Clinic, because showing up in a black armored car would start questions she couldn't afford. She walked the rest in worn sneakers, hair still damp, cardigan buttoned wrong, wedding ring turned inward like a bruise. Inside, the waiting room smelled of disinfectant and cheap coffee. Laura flipped the lights on, booted up the front desk computer, and started the day the way she always did, quietly, carefully, as if kindness was a job requirement. She printed intake forms for Mr. Donnelly, who forgot his glasses again, and wrote the questions in thick markers so he wouldn't feel embarrassed. She slid a granola bar to a pregnant teenager who hadn't eaten since yesterday. When the insurance hotline put her on hold, Laura mouthed apologies to the patients, then stayed on the line anyway, fighting for approvals like the money was coming out of her own pocket, because sometimes it was. Her self-sacrificing habit was simple. Every Friday, she skipped lunch and used the $20 to cover someone's medication gap. No one saw it. She told herself it didn't matter. Helping people felt cleaner than the life she'd been living at home. At 9:12, her phone buzzed. A message from Grant's number, cold as a receipt. Stop making scenes. Signatures filed. Don't contact me. Another buzz followed, her clinic payroll app flashing an error she'd never seen. She refreshed. Again, account unavailable. Laura's stomach tightened. She opened her bank app. The balance was there, then vanished, replaced by a gray banner. Review in progress. Her mother's dialysis appointment was tomorrow, and the copay sat in an envelope under her kitchen Bible. She stared until the letters blurred. "Laura!" Her supervisor Marcy called from the hallway. "Two men in suits are asking for you. They say it's urgent, and they won't tell me why." Laura rose too fast, chair legs scraping. In the glass of the check-in window, she caught her own face, pale, older, alone. The clinic door chimed and Marcy's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're holding an envelope with your full name and your maiden name." The courier stepped forward and placed a sealed folder stamped Vanguard Holdings on Laura's desk. Laura carried the sealed Vanguard folder into the clinic's supply closet, the only place that smelled like paper instead of fear. Her hands shook as she broke the sticker and slid out the contents. Before she could read a single page, her mind jumped to the real deadline. Tomorrow at 6 a.m., her mother's dialysis chair would be waiting. Or it wouldn't. Margaret Hale was 71, stubborn and shrinking. 2 years ago, a stroke had stolen half her speech. Kidney failure stole the rest of her strength. Laura's evenings were spent lifting her mother from bed to wheelchair, rubbing lotion into bruised ankles, counting pills into a plastic box while the TV mumbled gospel shows. When the bills came, Laura hid them in a shoebox under the sink, as if paper could be shamed into disappearing. Grant had learned that weakness and turned it into a leash. He insisted Laura leave her old job, promised family insurance, then put her on a tiny allowance with his name on every card. If she questioned it, he called her ungrateful. If she cried, he said she was unstable. When the first hospital sent a $38,000 statement, he slid a document across the table and told her it was just to authorize payment. She signed because her mother was wheezing in the next room and he was the only one offering air. Only later did she realize it wasn't a payment form. It was a personal guarantee tied to his startup loan, her maiden name stamped beside his. Her credit collapsed. Collection calls followed her into work. She stopped meeting friends for coffee because she couldn't afford to pretend. Grant liked it that way. Isolation was cheaper than love. Now her phone showed zero access to money, and her mother's pharmacy app flashed. Refill denied. Laura called the dialysis center anyway, voice low, trying not to tremble. The receptionist sighed. "Mrs. Hale is marked self-pay as of midnight. We'll need a deposit before treatment." Laura pressed her forehead to a shelf of latex gloves. Midnight. The same hour Grant made her sign the divorce. She looked back at the Vanguard pages. On top was a notarized copy of a medical power of attorney naming Grant Mercer as Margaret's agent. Laura stared at the signature line. It wasn't her handwriting. By noon, the storm had washed Chicago clean, leaving the streets glossy and cold. The Maybach stopped beneath the mirrored canopy of Blue Arc Systems, Grant's headquarters, where doormen in charcoal coats moved like chess pieces. Laura stepped out with the Vanguard folder inside her tote, feeling every stare slide over her thrift store cardigan as if it were a stain on the marble. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of money, White stone floors, a living wall of orchids, and a silent screen looping Grant's face beside the words, "Visionary of the Year." A security camera dome blinked above the reception desk. Another watched the elevators. Laura clocked them automatically now. Cameras were proof, and proof was safety. "Miss Hale?" A receptionist glanced at a tablet and froze for half a second. "You're expected." She offered a visitor badge already printed with Laura's maiden name in small letters beneath it. Laura swallowed, clipped it on, and followed a corridor that smelled of lemon polish and power. At the end, a glass boardroom floated above the city like an aquarium. Men and women in tailored suits sat around a long table, their laptops open, their smiles practiced. A microphone puck waited in the center, its red ring lit. On the far wall, a giant monitor showed a countdown. Series C wire transfer, 001742. Whispers chased her as she took a chair against the wall. "That's her, the wife. I thought she'd be gone." The CFO, David Lynn, paced with a phone pressed to his ear, voice tight. An HR director stood near the door with a folder labeled Morality Clause. Laura's heart kicked hard. So the clause was real. So was the recall. Then the screen flickered. The countdown vanished, replaced by a stark message. "Transfer revoked. Account on hold." A murmur rolled through the room like thunder under glass. At that exact moment, the doors opened again, and Grant Mercer stepped in, immaculate in a navy suit, smiling as if nothing in the world could touch him. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. He saw Laura and stopped. His gaze dropped to the badge on her chest, to the maiden name, and several directors shifted, suddenly unsure who should stand first. For the first time in 3 years, he looked afraid, and he hid it fast. Grant walked to the microphone, hit the speaker button, and said, "Vanguard, put her on the line." Grant Mercer had always treated rooms like stages. In college, he practiced handshakes in mirrors. Now he practiced sincerity. He stood at the head of the blue arc board table, palms open, voice warm, while the directors stared at the frozen transfer notice. His suit was perfect, but a vein jumped at his temple. "Everyone breathe," he said, smiling hard. "Vanguard is conservative. They test you. They scare you, then they sign." Laura watched him with a new clarity. At home, Grant's calm was a weapon. When her mother's bills arrived, he would kiss Laura's forehead, promise help, then slide her debit card back into his wallet for safety. If she asked for cash, he'd say she was bad with numbers. If she protested, he'd remind her he owned the lease, the car, even the phone in her hand. Dependence wasn't an accident. It was his design. In the boardroom, he used the same design. He pointed at Laura without looking directly at her, as if she were a stain on the glass. "My estranged wife is upset," he told the directors, chuckling. "Personal matter. She's confused. She thinks she's entitled to decisions she doesn't understand." Sienna sat near him, legs crossed, eyes hungry. Grant's motive was written in her posture. An IPO photo, a polished wife, a clean story. Laura, with her clinic badge and thrift sweater, didn't match the brand. The CFO whispered, "Grant, the recall clause cites morality breach." Grant's smile thinned. "Then we correct the narrative," he said. He clicked his tablet, and an assistant hurried to dim the lights. "We show Vanguard we're stable. We show the market this is a dispute, not corporate risk." He leaned into the microphone puck. "Marcus Vance," he said into speakerphone, tone slick. "Let's fix your people's overreaction. Blue Arc cannot be punished over a private divorce." A calm voice answered. "Mr. Mercer, you triggered the clause at 11:42 p.m. Central. You understand what that means?" Grant's fingers tightened on the table edge. "I understand leverage," he snapped, then forced a laugh. "Tell your chairman he's being emotional. I'll send the signed papers to prove the issue is closed." He turned, meeting Laura's eyes. "You wanted consequences?" he murmured. "Fine. You'll be the reason my company bleeds." Then he lifted his hand toward the security door. Grant signaled the guards and ordered, "Escort her out, after we play the footage." Sienna Park rose first, smiling like she'd won a raffle instead of a man. She slid into the empty chair beside Grant and set her phone on the table, camera lens facing Laura, as if Laura were the criminal. "Board members," Sienna said, voice honeyed, "before we discuss funding, we need to address the instability that walked in here." She nodded toward the HR director, Ellen Price, who opened her folder labeled Morality Clause and pulled out a printed statement. Ellen cleared her throat. "At 11:46 p.m. last night, Mr. Mercer reported a domestic incident involving Ms. Hale. He requested immediate corporate protection." Grant's jaw tightened, but he kept his hands folded, the picture of wounded leadership. "I didn't want this public," he said, lying smoothly. "But Vanguard needs to know my company isn't exposed." Sienna tapped her screen. A photo filled the monitor. Laura in the clinic parking lot, helping her mother into a wheelchair, rain streaking her face. The caption read, "Unable to manage emotions, financially reckless." Laura's stomach dropped. Someone had followed her. "She's been draining his resources for years," Sienna continued. "Medical bills, debt collectors, constant emergencies. Grant tried to help. She weaponized pity." Her eyes flicked to the directors. "That's why she's here. Blackmail. She thinks tears can move billions." Laura stood, palms flat on the glass. "My mother's dialysis isn't a story you get to use," she said. "And Grant forged papers with my name." Sienna laughed softly. "See? Paranoia." She turned to the guards at the door. "Remove her before she disrupts the call." 2 guards stepped in. The room tightened. The microphone's red ring stayed lit, recording every word. David Lynn, the CFO, whispered, "Grant, if Vanguard hears this—" "That's the point," Grant murmured back. "They'll see she's unstable." Ellen reached for the remote. "We also have security footage from Mr. Mercer's residence," she announced, "to confirm the nature of the incident." Laura's heart thudded. Footage meant truth if it hadn't been edited. On the wall screen, the image switched from the frozen transfer notice to a dark penthouse living room, time-stamped 11:42 p.m., and Laura saw her own shadow by the marble table. In the corner of the video, a tiny red dot blinked above the bar, her smoke detector camera. Someone had captured first everything, including who pushed the pen into her hand. Sienna leaned closer and whispered, "Let them watch you beg." The boardroom lights dimmed until the city outside became a gray aquarium. On the screen, Grant's penthouse video filled the wall. Laura's tired face, the marble table, the divorce packet. But the first thing the clip showed wasn't his hand shoving the pen at her. It started late, right at the moment her voice cracked. "Please," the edited audio played, her own words cut and rearranged. "Just give me the money." A director frowned. Someone whispered, "Extortion." Across the table, 2 assistants typed notes without looking up. A director's phone vibrated with a news alert. Laura realized this wasn't just a meeting. It was a rehearsal for headlines, and she was the planned villain. Laura felt heat crawl up her neck. She remembered what she had actually said. Not money, not mercy, dialysis, medications, her mother's chair at 6 a.m. That truth wasn't in the clip. The clip turned her into a beggar. Grant stood beside the screen like a teacher. "You see?" he said softly. "I tried to be generous. She escalated." Sienna's laugh sliced the quiet. "She ripped the settlement like a child," she said. "Drama for attention. That's why we need protection." The video jumped to the check tearing. No sound of Grant calling her replaceable, no shot of his arm around Sienna, just Laura's hands shaking and the paper splitting. The board members watched as if it proved she was dangerous. Ellen from HR leaned forward. "Ms. Hale, do you deny creating a hostile scene at Mr. Mercer's residence?" Laura's clinic badge dug into her collarbone. In her wallet, the dialysis copay envelope felt suddenly obscene, like evidence of weakness. "I deny the story you're selling," she said. "He forged my mother's power of attorney. He froze my accounts the minute I signed." Grant's smile didn't move. "Listen to her," he murmured. "Conspiracies. She's under stress." A woman on the board shook her head, pity hardening into judgment. "Laura, this isn't the place for personal instability." Two guards stepped closer. Laura heard their shoes on the polished floor, each step a small sentence. She swallowed the urge to cry, because crying was what they wanted on camera. As the clip ended, a tiny file label flashed at the bottom of the screen. raw_1142_smoked debt, before Ellen snapped her laptop shut. Laura caught it anyway. Behind the door, she heard Ellen hiss to I, "Delete the raw file before Vanguard asks for it." Laura didn't wait. While the board argued over the frozen wire, she slipped into the hall, keeping her face blank like she belonged there. The glass walls amplified every whisper. Unstable, liability, escort, until the words felt stitched to her skin. Around the corner, Ellen Price stood with an IT manager in a blue arc polo. Ellen's voice was sharp. "Pull the file labeled raw_1142_ debt. Scrub it from the conference drive, then overwrite the cache. If Vanguard requests records, they get the edited clip only." The IT manager hesitated. "That feed auto-backs up to the building's security cloud." "Then delete it there too," Ellen snapped, "and wipe the access logs." Laura's pulse hammered. She leaned closer, pretending to read a framed mission statement, and caught the IT manager's badge. J. Rivera. Beneath it, a lanyard tag with the building vendor name, Zenith Tower Security. Zenith Tower. Not Grant's company. The building's. Ellen shoved a flash drive into Rivera's hand. "Do it now. Grant wants this clean before the call ends." Rivera swallowed. "Ma'am, deletion requests generate an audit email to the vendor compliance officer." Ellen froze for half a beat. "Then forward it to me." "It doesn't go to me," Rivera said quietly. "It goes to him." Laura followed his glance down the corridor. A tall, older man stood near the elevator bank, holding a tablet, posture calm as a judge. Silver hair, dark suit, no blue arc badge. He looked up once, and his eyes met Laura's, not curious, not flirtatious, just measuring. Rivera lowered his voice. "That's Mr. Wainwright, Zenith Security Chief. He signs off on camera access." Ellen recovered her smile and walked toward the man like she owned the air. "Hector, hi. Tech issue. We're handling it." The man didn't smile back. "I saw the request populate," he said. "Raw files are retained 90 days by policy. Why are you asking for an exception?" Ellen's laugh sounded too bright. "Privacy. Divorce drama.
You know how it is.
Hector's gaze flicked to Laura's visitor badge, maiden name visible, then back to Ellen. Policy exists for a reason, he said evenly. So does the law. Laura's lungs found oxygen. Proof wasn't gone. It was sitting on a server Grant couldn't bully. Hector tapped his tablet once. A chime sounded from Rivera's phone, an email notification, time-stamped. Hector turned to Laura and said, "Ms. Hale, I need you to tell me what happened at 11:42. Hector didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped between Laura and Ellen like a door that could not be pushed. "No deletions," he said, "and no more talking around me." Ellen's smile tightened. "We're in a board meeting, Hector. Security reports to the company." "Security reports to the building," Hector replied, "and the building reports to law." Before Laura could speak, Grant's assistant appeared, breathless. "Mr. Mercer needs you back inside, now." Hector glanced at Laura. "Tell me the truth in one sentence." "He forced me to sign," Laura whispered. "Then he froze my money and forged my mother's papers." Hector's jaw set, but he didn't promise anything. "Stay where cameras can see you," he said, and walked toward the boardroom doors. Laura followed, feeling the trap tighten with every step. The moment she crossed the threshold, Grant's eyes locked on her like a hook. He didn't look relieved to see her. He looked ready to crush her. "Ms. Hale," Ellen announced, loud enough for the speakerphone to catch, "you are not authorized to be on this floor. Your visitor pass has been revoked." A guard reached for Laura's badge. When she resisted, his fingers pinched her collar, hard. "Don't," she said, steady but shaking. Grant leaned back in his chair. "See?" he told the directors. "Unstable." David Lynn swallowed. "Grant, this is getting dangerous." "It's getting clean," Grant said. He nodded to Ellen. Ellen slid a single-page document across the glass table toward Laura. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Voluntary Statement." "If you sign," Ellen said, "Blue Arc will unfreeze a hardship payment for your mother's treatment. If you don't, we will report you for extortion and trespass. The police are already downstairs." Laura's mouth went dry. Dialysis. 6 a.m. Deposit required. Her mother's weak hand searching for hers. Grant's voice softened, almost kind. "This is your last chance to be cooperative, Laura. Admit you tried to threaten me. Walk away with dignity." Dignity. He had priced it at $50,000. Laura looked to the board for help and found only averted eyes. Even the speakerphone stayed silent, as if Vanguard was listening and choosing not to intervene yet. Grant stood, buttoning his jacket. "Since you won't behave," he said, "let's end your options." Ellen lifted a court-stamped petition naming Grant as emergency guardian over Margaret Hale, effective immediately, with hospital access authority. Grant held the court petition high, letting the seal catch the boardroom lights. "Emergency guardian," he said, savoring the words. "Effective immediately. My attorneys moved fast after last night's episode." Sienna exhaled in delight. Ellen slid the paper closer to the microphone so the speakerphone could hear the crisp shuffle. "Vanguard," Ellen said, syrupy, "we take character risks seriously. Ms. Hale is under stress and has been making irrational demands. Mr. Mercer is protecting an incapacitated senior from exploitation." Laura's knees went weak. "That's my mother," she said. "You can't—" Grant cut her off with a small, cruel smile. "I can. I just did." He tapped his tablet, and the wall screen changed from the transfer notice to a scanned image of Margaret Hale's medical chart, redacted except for one line. Payment required prior to treatment. Beneath it, a note. Authorized by Guardian, G. Mercer. A low murmur rolled through the directors. Someone whispered, "Dialysis?" Another voice, "This is insane." Laura clutched the strap of her tote. Inside was the envelope with tomorrow's copay, corners soft from her fingers. She thought of her mother's wedding band on a chain, the way Margaret kissed it when the pain spiked. Grant watched that thought cross her face and leaned closer. "Sign the voluntary statement," he murmured, quiet enough to sound intimate, loud enough to be humiliating. "Say you tried to extort me. Then I'll approve your mother's treatment. Or I'll let her chair sit empty at 6 a.m. Heat flashed behind Laura's eyes, but she forced her voice steady. "You're using my mother as a hostage." Grant straightened and addressed the room. "You hear the accusations," he said. "This is why I'm divorcing her. She's a liability." Ellen nodded to the guards. One grabbed Laura's tote and shook it once. The envelope fell out, scattering bills and a small framed photo, Laura, Margaret, and Grant on their wedding day. The glass cracked on the floor. Sienna laughed. "Look," Sienna said, pointing. "Even her memories are cheap." The speakerphone clicked, and Marcus Vance's calm voice filled the silence. "Mr. Mercer," he said, colder now, "who authorized access to Miss Hale's mother's records?" Grant blinked, just once. Around them, the ceiling cameras kept blinking, and 3 assistants quietly recorded minutes, their faces stiff, as if the room itself was testifying. Hector Wainwright stepped forward and said, "I did, because I'm preserving the raw footage for Vanguard's counsel." Silence hit first, not the calm kind, but the hush that follows a slap in public. Every director stared at Laura as if she'd dragged rain and poverty into their glass temple. The speakerphone breathed on the table, and Marcus Vance didn't interrupt. He let the room reveal itself. Ellen recovered fastest. "For the record," she said, "Ms. Hale is making unverified allegations. Security will escort her out. We'll continue without disruption." A few heads nodded, relief disguised as judgment. One director slid her chair back, distancing herself. Another turned his laptop so Laura couldn't see the screen, the way people hide their wallets on a subway. Sienna leaned toward a board member and murmured something that made him smirk, then look away when Laura met his eyes. The guards moved in. Laura lifted her hands slowly, not to surrender, but to keep her dignity visible on camera. "Don't touch me," she said, voice low. The words sounded small in that room, swallowed by money. David Lynn wouldn't look at her. "Laura, please," he whispered, eyes on the table. "You're making it worse." Worse. As if truth had a volume control. The HR director took Laura's tote from the guard and dumped it onto a side credenza. The Vanguard folder slid out, pages fanning like wings. Ellen snapped it shut and tucked it under her arm. "Corporate property," she said quickly. "This is evidence in a security matter." "That's mine," Laura said. Ellen smiled without warmth. "Not anymore." Then the real scar landed. A director's phone chimed, and the headline reflected in the glass wall. "CEO faces domestic extortion claim. Sources." Someone had already fed the story to media. In the corner, an assistant's fingers trembled as she typed minutes, eyes glossy, trapped between loyalty and conscience. The guard removed Laura's visitor badge. The clip scraped her skin. As he turned her toward the door, her phone buzzed. One alert from her bank app. Access terminated. Immediately after, another pharmacy order canceled. Laura's breath caught. She pictured her mother's empty dialysis chair at dawn. When they pushed her into the hallway, she glanced down and realized her key ring was gone, the clinic keys, her mother's apartment key, the small brass key to the shoebox under the sink. Sienna's voice followed her like perfume. "You'll have nowhere to go." Hector's tablet pinged, and his face hardened as he read. Raw_1142, file locked, legal hold approved. The elevator dropped Laura to the lobby like a verdict. She walked past the orchids, past the reception desk that wouldn't meet her eyes, and out into the wind that sliced between buildings. Her cheeks were dry until she reached the alley beside the tower, where the noise of traffic dulled and she could finally breathe without performing. She leaned against the brick and opened her phone again. Bank, locked. Payroll, error. Pharmacy, canceled. Dialysis center, deposit required. The screen glare made her feel exposed, like everyone could see the numbers she didn't have. A memory hit. Margaret's hands, thin as paper, pressing Laura's wedding photo to her chest after the stroke, whispering, "He'll come around." Laura swallowed hard. Grant had come around all right. He'd come around with papers, cameras, and a knife disguised as procedure. Her legs folded and she sat on a milk crate behind a dumpster, the kind of place she used to scold herself for noticing. She tucked her head down, not to hide, but to keep the sobs quiet. Tears dropped onto the cracked screen, making Grant's last text smear into nonsense. Good, she thought. Let the lies blur. Inside her chest, anger began to warm what fear had frozen. She pictured Ellen's mouth forming the word delete, and Rivera's hesitation, and Hector's calm eyes. Someone had heard. Someone had seen. Evidence existed, and for once it wasn't in Grant's hands. Her hands trembled, but she squared her shoulders as if the alley were a courtroom and she was sworn in. Laura wiped her face with her sleeve and forced her breathing slow, like she taught anxious patience in the waiting room. One sentence rose in her mind, clean and final. "I'm done begging." She stood, steadier now, and pulled the Vanguard folder's corner from her tote. The fraud stamp, the forged power of attorney, the court petition. These weren't feelings, they were facts. If Grant wanted to make her a headline, she would become a witness instead. Her phone buzzed again. Not a bank alert this time. Unknown number. Laura hesitated, thumb hovering, then answered. "Hello?" A man's voice, low and controlled. "Miss Hale, this is Marcus Vance. Don't speak near anyone. Are you alone?" She looked up. Across the alley, a security camera pointed straight at her, its red light steady. Marcus said, "Good, because the raw footage shows who forged your mother's signature." Marcus's instructions were simple. Go straight to your mother, keep your phone on, don't confront Grant alone. Laura nodded even though he couldn't see her. She left the alley and walked fast toward the clinic parking lot where the Maybach waited like a secret she wasn't ready to claim. At Lakeside, Marcy caught her at the door. "Laura, HR called," she whispered. "They said you're involved in corporate theft?" "They want you suspended until it's resolved." "I'm sorry." The word suspended hit harder than the wind. No paycheck meant no rent, no groceries, no medication. Laura forced a thank you, grabbed her coat, and drove with shaking hands to Mercy Dialysis Center. The receptionist looked up, then away. "Mrs. Hale is checked in," she said. But only the guardian can authorize treatment today. Laura slid the envelope of cash across the counter. Please, I have the deposit. The woman pushed it back. It isn't about money anymore. A security officer approached, polite but firm. Ma'am, you need to step aside. Through the glass doors, Laura saw her mother in a recliner, blanket tucked under her chin, eyes searching the room like a child who'd lost the map home. Laura lifted her hand to wave. Margaret's lips moved. Laura's name, soundless. The officer blocked the view. Mr. Mercer filed an order, he said quietly. You're not permitted to enter the treatment area. Laura's throat closed. He's not family, she said. He's a thief. The officer's expression didn't change. Argue it with the court. Outside, her phone buzzed. A text from her landlord. Late again. Eviction notice filed. Another buzz. Her clinic login disabled. Then a final one from an unknown number with a photo attachment. Her mother's apartment door, new deadbolts gleaming, and a note taped over the peephole. Access revoked. Laura stood on the sidewalk, dizzy, watching patients arrive with family members who held their bags and their stories. She had never felt so invisible. She tried calling Margaret's room phone. It rang again until voicemail, then clicked off. Grant had changed the contact list. When Laura stepped closer to the doors, the officer lifted his radio. Ma'am, last warning. Behind the glass, her mother's eyes drifted shut, the machine beeping steadily, and Laura felt her world slipping out of reach. A shadow fell across her. A deep voice said, Miss Hale, I'm Hector Wainwright, and I saw everything on the raw feed. Hector Wainwright wore no badge, yet the dialysis guard stepped back the moment he spoke. I'm building security for Zenith Tower, he said, showing a laminated credential and then a second card with a gold seal. Vanguard Holdings Compliance Liaison. And I'm here to prevent abuse. The guard frowned. Mr. Mercer is listed as guardian. Temporarily, Hector replied. And the order is being challenged today. Laura's throat tightened. You can't just walk in. I can't, Hector said, softer to her. But I can document, escalate, and get you in front of the right people before your mother misses treatment. He pulled out his phone, tapped once, and put it on speaker. Administrator Reyes, this is Wainwright. You have an involuntary guardianship dispute on your floor. I need compliance at the desk, now. Within minutes, a woman in scrubs arrived, eyes sharp. Hector handed her a folder. Notice of contest, he said, plus a preservation letter. If treatment is denied because of a forged appointment of agent, your facility becomes part of the record. Reyes scanned the pages and inhaled. Miss Hale, your family? I'm her daughter, Laura whispered. Then you'll be allowed to sit with her during prep, Reyes said. But the guardian still signs. Hector nodded. That's fine. We're not signing anything today. He turned to Laura. Your job is to hold her hand and keep her calm. Mine is to stop Mercer from using her chart as a weapon. Laura finally saw her mother again, skin waxy, eyes watery, but alive. Margaret squeezed her fingers twice, a code they'd invented after the stroke. Don't leave. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to apologize for being sick. Laura kissed her knuckles and whispered, I'm here. The machine's steady beep sounded like a metronome counting down Grant's control. In the hallway, Hector kept his voice low. The raw penthouse feed shows the whole sequence, including the moment Mercer photocopied your mother's signature from an old consent form. He watched Laura flinch. Vanguard's counsel is ready to file an emergency motion, but they need you focused, not terrified. Laura swallowed. "Why help me?" "Because I was ordered to," Hector said. Then he corrected himself. "Because it's right." He opened his briefcase and slid out a slim black binder, tabbed and dated. "Meet me at 7 p.m. at Vanguard's legal office," Hector said. "This file is how we take your life back." Vanguard's legal office sat 3 blocks from the river, all brushed steel and quiet carpet, the kind of place where people whispered even when they were innocent. At 7:02 p.m., Hector led Laura through a security gate that read, "Clearance required." Her clinic cardigan was still damp at the cuffs, and her mother's plastic dialysis bracelet was looped around her wrist like a promise. In a small conference room, Marcus Vance appeared on a wall monitor, tie loosened, eyes unreadable. Beside Hector sat a gray-haired attorney, Nora Klein, who set a recorder on the table. "Laura Hale," Nora said. "This meeting creates a chain of custody. Everything we review can be used in court." Hector opened the black binder. Tab 1, raw_1142_ debt. He played 30 seconds. The unedited video showed Grant guiding Laura's hand to the signature line, Sienna laughing, then Grant lifting a manila folder marked Margaret Hale, Poe. He slid an old hospital consent form under a copier lid, pressed a button, and peeled off a perfect signature sample. Laura's stomach lurched. Marcus's voice came through the speaker, calm and lethal. "That's forgery," he said, "and coercion." Tab 2, Email Audit. Nora pointed to timestamps. 11:58 p.m., HR requests deletion of raw footage. 12:01 a.m., Mercer's assistant submits a hardship freeze form to your bank, listing you as a security risk. 12:04 a.m., pharmacy cancellation request. 12:07 a.m., guardianship petition uploaded to the court e-filing portal. Tab 3, Building Logs. Hector slid forward a printout showing Zenith Towers access records. Grant's badge had entered the copy room at 11:39. Ellen Price logged into the conference drive at 11:47. Rivera's account attempted a deletion at 12:10, denied because Hector locked the file. Laura gripped the dialysis bracelet until it cut her skin. "He did it to control me," she said. "If my mother can't be treated, I'll sign anything." Nora nodded once. "Then we make sure you never have to sign again." Hector closed the binder and looked at Marcus. "We have enough to challenge guardianship tonight." Marcus didn't smile. "Enough to destroy him," he said. "But to win cleanly, we need one final piece." He turned the camera toward a document on his desk, a patent assignment with a blank signature line. Nora slid a pen toward her, gold, unshakable. Outside, rain started again, tapping the windows softly. "If you sign this, Laura, you become the legal owner of what Grant calls his empire." Laura stared at the blank signature line on the patent assignment, as if the ink could change her past. Marcus Vance leaned closer to the camera. "Grant calls Blue Arc his empire," he said. "But the crown jewel isn't his stock. It's the predictive triage algorithm that makes hospitals pay. And that algorithm has one inventor." Nora slid 3 certificates across the table. United States Patent and Trademark Office. On each, the inventor line read, Laura Bennett Hale. Her maiden name sat there like a door she'd forgotten how to open. "I didn't invent anything," Laura whispered. "I answered phones. I made coffee." Hector opened a tabbed section labeled Code Review. "You rewrote his model," he said calmly. "See the commit history?" 3 years ago, his repository was failing. The weekend he disappeared to Aspen, you fixed the training loop, rebuilt the error correction, and documented it. We have timestamps, IP addresses, and the clinic Wi-Fi logs. Marcus added, Grant signed a licensing agreement, not an ownership transfer. Vanguard Intellectual Property owns the patents. Vanguard Holdings owns the company's shares. Grant only held an operating lease, revocable for misconduct. Laura's hands trembled. Then why let him do this to me? Nora's voice softened. Because you asked. You wanted a marriage without a price tag. Your father agreed on one condition, a morality clause. Treat you with respect, protect your family, and the lease stays. Violate it, and Vanguard can step in. Marcus nodded. We couldn't reveal you while you were still choosing him. The moment you signed the divorce under coercion, the clause triggered. That's why we can act now and why the raw footage matters. Laura felt air return to her lungs. Rage and relief braided together until they became something steady. Marcus held her gaze through the screen. Laura, you're not powerless, he said. You've been restrained, not defeated. Nora pushed the pen toward her again. Sign, and we file tonight. Injunctions to restore your accounts, emergency motions to void guardianship, and a board resolution removing Mercer at first light. Laura signed, slow and certain. The ink didn't just mark paper. It marked a return. Hector slid a new badge across the table. Vanguard Representative. Nora sealed the exhibits in envelopes. At last, the clock sounded like a countdown to justice today. At 8 a.m., Grant will walk into the boardroom and see the real owner take the mic. Laura left Vanguard after midnight, the new badge tucked in her coat pocket like a heartbeat. The Maybach carried her to Mercy Dialysis, where Margaret slept in a recliner, blanket pulled to her chin. Laura sat beside her and watched the rise and fall of her mother's chest until the panic in her own chest eased. At 1:17 a.m., her phone lit up with Grant's name. She didn't answer. She opened Nora's email instead. Court motions attached, time stamps, hearing request, and one line in bold. Do not engage him privately. Laura smiled for the first time all day, because a rule existed that wasn't his. She turned her wedding ring slowly, then slid it off and placed it in her purse next to the cracked family photo. I loved you, she whispered, not to Grant, but to the version of herself that kept apologizing. That part is over. In the hallway, she called Marcy at the clinic. I'm suspended, Laura said. I'm not begging for my job back, but I need my personal files and my mother's records released to me. Please don't let them bully you. Marcy's voice shook. Laura, they scared me. I know, Laura said. You don't have to fight. Just don't lie. Next, she called the landlord. The locks were changed illegally, she said, calm. You'll receive an injunction by morning. If anything disappears from my unit, your name will be on the police report. Silence, then a stammered apology. Power, she realized, was mostly tone. Hector arrived at 2:10 with a small paper bag. Inside was a prepaid phone, a temporary debit card in Laura's name, and a printed schedule for 8 a.m. You won't be alone, he said. Board counsel, compliance, and 2 independent witnesses. Cameras will be on. Laura looked at her mother, then at the bag. No more pleading, she said. No more pleas to people who profit from my fear. She stood, straightened her shoulders, and practiced one sentence aloud, slow and steady. I'm here as owner's representative, and I'm placing Grant Mercer on notice. She washed her face in the restroom sink, pinned her hair, and borrowed a navy blazer from Reyes's office. In the mirror, she looked plain, but her eyes finally looked awake at long last. At dawn, Laura would walk back into Blue Ark with the raw file, the patents, and her mother watching from a protected room. Before sunrise, Laura returned to Vanguard's suite for final prep. Nora met her with a garment bag and a stack of colored tabs. "No costume," Nora warned. "Just clean lines." Laura changed into a navy pantsuit that fit her shoulders and hid the tremor in her hands. She swapped her clinic sneakers for low black pumps, brushed her hair into a smooth twist, and dabbed concealer over the sleepless shadows. It wasn't a glow-up for vanity. It was armor for a room built to punish weakness. Hector laid 3 envelopes on the table. Exhibit A, raw penthouse feed, certified by Zenith Tower. He tapped the first. Exhibit B, bank freeze request and deletion emails with headers. The second. Exhibit C, patent certificates and licensing terms. The third. Marcus appeared on screen again, already in the Blue Ark building. "They'll try to interrupt," he said. "Let them. Every interruption proves intent." Laura practiced her opening statement, slow and plain. "I'm Laura Hale, authorized representative for Vanguard Intellectual Property and Vanguard Holdings." Nora corrected one word. "Say authorized agent. Courts like that." Hector handed her a thumb drive with a tamper seal and a printed chain of custody form for each file. Laura signed, then watched Hector place the sealed drive into a clear evidence pouch. They walked through the timeline once. 7:55 a.m., security escorts Laura to the boardroom. 7:58, Nora serves the temporary restraining order on Ellen and Grant. 8 o'clock, Marcus calls the meeting to order and recognizes Laura. 8:03, raw footage plays. 8:07, Administrator Reyes appears by video to confirm the dialysis coercion. 8:10, the board votes on removal, while Vanguard freezes executive access cards. Laura's phone buzzed. A photo from Mercy showing her mother awake, smiling faintly, protected by staff. Hope steadied her breath. She slipped the cracked wedding photo into her pocket, not as a wound, but as a reminder. At the lobby of Blue Ark, the elevator doors gleamed like a mirror. Laura held the evidence pouch against her ribs. Hector checked his earpiece. "Board counsel is in place. Press is outside. They won't enter, but they'll see who walks out." Nora pressed a sealed copy of the injunction into Laura's hand. "If he speaks, you say nothing until the mic is yours," she whispered, "and remember, cameras are your silent witnesses." When the doors opened on the executive floor, Grant was already standing there, waiting to erase her again. The executive floor smelled like espresso and panic. Grant was waiting by the boardroom doors, smile locked in place, but his eyes flicked to the clear evidence pouch against Laura's ribs. "You again," he said, loud enough for the assistants and cameras. "This is harassment." Nora stepped beside Laura and handed Ellen Price a stapled packet. "Temporary restraining order," Nora said, "and an emergency petition contesting guardianship. Service is complete." Ellen's hands trembled as she read the judge's signature. Grant's jaw clenched. "This is a stunt," he snapped. "Security!" Hector's voice cut in, calm. "Security answers to Zenith Tower. Stand down." 2 uniformed building officers appeared behind him, body cameras blinking. Marcus Vance came through the speakerphone. "This meeting is now called to order," he said. "First item, risk disclosure. Ms. Hale will present." Grant lunged toward the microphone puck. Laura reached it first. She didn't raise her voice. At 11:42 p.m. yesterday, Mr. Mercer coerced my divorce signature, then used forged documents to seize control of my mother's care, she said. We have unedited video and audit trails. A director scoffed. Show it. Hector nodded to IT. The screen switched. Raw_1142_smoke debt played in full. Grant guiding Laura's hand, Sienna laughing. Then Grant copying Margaret Hale's signature. The room went still. Even Sienna's lipstick smile collapsed. Ellen whispered, "Turn it off." "Keep it on," Marcus ordered. "Let the record stand." Nora clicked a second file. Email headers filled the screen. Deletion request, bank freeze form, pharmacy cancellation. The CFO, David Lynn, stared at the timestamps and swallowed. "Grant, what did you do?" Grant's face reddened. "She's manipulating you. She stole my code. Administrator Reyes appeared on video in scrums. "Dialysis was threatened unless Ms. Hale signed a false statement," she said. "I witnessed the attempt to block her access today." One director stood. "Motion to remove Mercer as CEO and freeze executive privileges." Hands rose around the table. David's rose last. Grant shoved his chair back, breathing hard. He reached across the table toward Laura's evidence pouch, fingers grabbing for the sealed drive. One officer caught his wrist. The tamper seal held. Laura didn't flinch. "Threatening a patient is criminal," she said. Marcus's voice turned iron. "Mr. Mercer, you are removed. Your access is revoked effective this second." Grant's badge beeped red, loudly, twice. Grant hissed, "If you play that file again, your mother won't make it to tomorrow." Grant's threat didn't hang in the air for long. Hector's officers were already recording, and Marcus Vance didn't miss a syllable. "Noted," he said into the speakerphone. "That statement will be forwarded to the court and to the district attorney." Nora stepped between Laura and Grant. "Do not approach her," she warned. "You are now under a protective order." Grant tried to lunge anyway, but the building officers turned him gently, firmly, and walked him out. His badge kept flashing red as if the walls themselves rejected him. Sienna stood up too, shaking, and an officer stopped her at the door with another packet, termination for cause and notice of investigation for expense fraud. She opened her mouth to protest, then saw the cameras and remembered she'd been laughing on raw footage. Inside the boardroom, the directors finally looked at Laura like a person instead of a problem. David Lynn cleared his throat. "Ms. Hale, Laura, I'm sorry. We failed you." He pushed a motion across the table, reinstatement of her accounts, back pay for the clinic disruption, and a public correction to the extortion story. Board Chair Linda Carver rose and addressed the room's recorder. "Let it be clear," she said, "Ms. Hale acted under duress. The prior allegation was false." She looked at Grant's empty seat. "Blue Arc will cooperate with law enforcement." By noon, the retraction ran on every outlet that had carried the smear, quoting verified video evidence and court filings. Grant's emergency guardianship was stayed the same day. The dialysis center received a formal notice naming Laura as medical agent, and Margaret's treatment continued without a single missed chair. 2 weeks later, Laura moved her mother into a small, sunlit condo near the lake. Not a penthouse, just a place with an elevator that worked, and neighbors who waved. She returned to Lakeside to finish her notice period, then accepted a new role, Patient Advocacy Director for Blue Arc's hospital partners, with veto power over any policy that could be used to punish families. On Sundays, Laura sat beside Margaret in a quiet church pew. The fear didn't vanish overnight, but it stopped running her life. She kept one rule written on a sticky note in her wallet. Love is not control. When a woman is cornered, truth is her exit. Keep copies. Notice the cameras. Tell one credible person, and never sign away your dignity to buy temporary peace. So, that story is closed now. And hey, if you're still here with me at this point, that means something in Laura's journey touched your heart in a real way. Maybe it reminded you of a time you stayed too long, forgave too much, or felt trapped by money, family duty, or fear of being judged. The lesson is simple, but it's not easy. Love is never supposed to feel like a leash. Control dressed up as protection is still control. And when you're cornered, your way out often starts with one quiet, practical choice. Save proof, tell one credible person, and stop negotiating with someone who benefits from your pain. There's a quote people often share: "You can't heal in the same environment that broke you." That's not selfish. That's self-respect. And here's the healthy selfishness part. Choosing your safety, your dignity, and your peace isn't abandoning others. It's finally refusing to abandon yourself. Healing looks like boundaries. Healing looks like clarity. Healing looks like saying, "I'm done begging." If this story spoke to you, please like, share, and subscribe, because you never know who needs to hear this tonight.